Hey, 6th grade, Mr. Herzberg here. Today we are it's moving right along, we are at May 4th, and we're going to be doing some Tom Sawyer today. We are going to be going over our journal, and we are going to be going over our homework from last Friday. So let's get started. This week's standard is RI, Reading Informational Text 6.4, and that is where the words the author chooses to use have a meaning on the text. Like remember we learned the unit on connotation and denotation. Connotation is the way a word makes you feel. Well, if an author picks certain words with, let's say, negative connotation, the writing itself will have a negative tone. If the author chooses words with a positive connotation, the writing will have a positive tone. If they use a lot of technical words, it might sound a little more technical. So you're going to read about who was Benedict Arnold. Remember, persuade, inform, or entertain. This is going to inform you. And the words listed on the right there, you've got number 1 to 5 on your Google Doc. You're going to have words that have multiple meanings. In other words, the author's choosing to use one of the many meanings they have in the dictionary. So you're going to find the meaning of each word in the dictionary. You can use dictionary.com, or you can just use a Google Define search. Type in define, colon, and then your word. And then you're going to use the context of the Who Was Benedict Arnold writing to decide the best definition for each word. So for example, brilliant is number 1. You're going to look through and just find out where brilliant was used in the text. There it is in the first sentence. Though he was a brilliant general, Benedict Arnold will forever be remembered as the most famous trader in American history. So your job would be go to Google, find all the definitions of brilliant, it's an adjective obviously, and then pick the one that you think the author is using. The other one is brewing, relieve, deepened, and credit. So just do these 5, again, give me the definition, and then how the word is being used in the text. Okay, so again, the words that authors use help tell the story, helps set the tone, okay, or the feeling that you get when you read something. That's this week's standard, okay? All right, cool. Let's go ahead next, and let's go over our Chapter 13 Tom Sawyer questions that you had Friday. Why did Joe and Tom want to run away? Well, Joe and Tom wanted to run away for a few reasons. Mainly because they were just tired of the adults in their lives telling them what to do. Joe's mom, I believe, whipped him and punished him because he went into the refrigerator and he ate essentially what we know today as Cool Whip. He ate a whole thing of Cool Whip without getting permission, essentially. And then Tom, where do I begin with Tom? He's mad because Becky scorned him. He tried to go get her, when she came back to school, he tried his best to sort of woo her, if you will, and get her attentions, and as soon as he did that, she ignored him. So his heart's broken. On top of that, he's stressed out from seeing what happened to the doc and knows the truth about Injun Joe murdering him. So Tom is just writhing with all this anxiety and sort of sadness and depression. So he is ready to run off. What kind of lifestyle were the boys going to live? They were all decided to become pirates. They were going to go out to Jackson's Island and make believe pirates. Where did they go live? Well, I just gave that one away. They went out into the middle of the Mississippi on a little island near St. Petersburg, a fictional town of St. Petersburg based on Mark Twain's town of Hannibal. And there's a little island called Jackson's Island the boys paddle out to in a little wooden boat, and they were just going to pretend. What did Tom and Joe say? Why did Tom and Joe say their prayers? Because they said if they didn't, something bad would happen to them, and they didn't want that right now. Even in their pirate fantasy, they still didn't want something bad to happen to them. It's just kind of an ingrained sort of routine. Who was the intruder that came to Joe and Tom and made them feel guilty for running away and stealing? Who did this? That would have been our good friend Huckleberry Finn. The intruder that came to Joe and Tom and made them feel guilty for running away. Why is Tom feeling so sorry for himself? Because he feels awful for running away and awful what he's been doing to Aunt Polly. Remember last time he got in trouble with her, she didn't care anymore. She just sort of gave up on him. She's disappointed. So that's breaking his heart. And on top of that, his whole life is he's put himself into a mess. What did Tom, Huck, and Joe Harper decide to do? Well, they decide they're going to live there permanently, and they're running away. They're not coming back. And they're going to let the town think that something awful's happened to them, like drowned perhaps. They go to Jackson's Island and they stay there. That's where they go and that's where they stay. So that's it for chapter 13. Let's move on now to chapter 14. In today's chapter, you're going to be seeing our good friend, Mr. Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and Joe Harper, and what they're doing on Jackson's Island now. So they're there, they've decided they're going to live there for a while. They're going to let the town think that they are dead. They don't care who knows, they don't care who doesn't know, and they've decided this is the new life for them. So as they're there, while they're there, Tom decides to have a little change of heart, and he wants to go back home. Again, it's almost at this point a competition to see who can become homesick first. Here we go. And let's see here. Yeah, it's a short chapter. When Tom wakes up in the morning, he wondered where he was. He sat up and rubbed his eyes and looked around. And then he comprehended. It was a cool gray dawn, and there was a delicious sense of repose and peace in the deep pervading calm and silence in the woods. Not a leaf stirred, not a sound obtruded upon nature's meditation. But beaded dewdrops stood on the leaves and grasses. A white layer of ash covered the fire, and a thin blue breath of smoke rose straight into the air. Joe and Huck were still asleep. Now far away in the woods a bird called. Another answered. Presently the hammering of a woodpecker was then heard, and gradually the cool dim gray in the morning whitened, and as gradually as the sounds multiplied and life manifested itself, the marvel of nature, shaking off sleep and going to work, unfolded itself, musing Tom. A little green worm then came crawling over the dew leaf, and lifted 2/3 of his body into the air for a time, and sniffed around, and then proceeded again, for he was measuring Tom. And then Tom said, and when the worm approached him, of its own accord, Tom sat as still as a stone, with his hopes of rising and falling by turns as the creature still came forward, or seemed inclined to go elsewhere. And when at last it consisted a painful moment, when its head curved in the air, and then came decidedly upon Tom's leg, and began a journey over him. His whole heart was glad. For that meant he was going to have a new suit of clothes, without the shadow of a doubt, gaudy, piratical uniform. Now a procession of ants appeared from nowhere in particular, and went about their labors. One struggled manfully with a dead spider 5 times as big as itself in its arms, and lugged it straight up a tree trunk. And then a brown-spotted ladybug climbed in dizzying heights of grass blade. Tom bent down close to it and said, "Ladybug, ladybug, fly away home. Your house is on fire, your children's alone." And she took wing and went off to see about it. When it did not surprise the boy, for he knew of all the old this insect was credulous about conflagulations, and he had practiced upon it simplicity that made once. A tumblebug then came next, having sturdily at its ball, and Tom touched the creature to see if it shut its legs and its body and pretended to be dead. The bird was fairly rioting by this time. A catbird, the northern mocker, lit in a tree over Tom's head, and trilled out its imitations of her neighbors, in a rapture of enjoyment. And then a shrill blue jay swept down, a flash of blue flame, and stopped on a twig and almost within the boy's reach, cocked his flame, and stopped on a twig almost within Tom's reach. He then moved his head to one side and eyed the stranger with a consuming curiosity. A gray squirrel was next, and a big fellow of the fox kind came scurrying along, sitting up intervals of inspect and chatter at the boys, for the wild things had probably never seen human beings before, and scarcely knew whether they could be afraid or not. All of nature was wide awake and stirring now. Long lances of sunlight peered through the dense fog, and near a few butterflies came fluttering. Tom stirred up the pirates, and they clattered away with a shout. And in a minute or two they were stripped, and chasing after one another, tumbling in the shallow, limpid waters of the white sandbar. They felt no longing for the little village, sleeping in the distance beyond the majestic waste of water. A vagrant current of a slight rise in the river had carried off their raft, but this only gratified them, since its going was something like burning the bridge between them and civilization. They came back to camp wonderfully refreshed, glad-hearted, and ravenous, and they soon had the campfire blazing upon them again. Huck found a spring of clear water close by, and the boys made cups of broad oak or hickory leaves, and felt that the water, sweetened with such a wild wood charm as that, would be a good enough substitute for coffee. While Joe was slicing bacon for breakfast, Tom and Huck asked him to hold on a minute, They stepped to a promising nook in the riverbank and threw in their lines. Almost immediately, they were rewarded. Joe had time to get impatient before they were back again, with some handsome bass, a couple of sun perch, and a small catfish. Provisions enough for quite a family. They fried the fish with the bacon and were astonished, for no fish had ever seemed so delicious before. They didn't know that the quicker freshwater fish, actually, on the fire after he caught, the better he is, and they reflected little upon a saucepan, open air sleeping, open air exercise, breathing, and large ingredients of hunger makes two. They laid around in the shade after breakfast while Huck and had a smoke, and then went off into the woods on an exploring expedition. They tramped gaily along over decaying logs, through tangled underbrush, among solemn monarchs of the forest, hung from their crowns to the ground with drooping regalia of grapevine. Now and then they would come upon snug nooks, carpeted with grass and jeweled with flowers. They found plenty of things to be delighted with, but nothing to be astonished at. They discovered that the island was about 3 miles long and 1/4 of a mile wide, and that the shore it lay closest to was only separated from it by a narrow channel, hardly 200 yards wide. They took a swim about every hour, so it was close upon the middle of the afternoon when they got back to camp. They were too hungry to stop for fish, but they fared sumptuously, there it is, upon cold ham, and threw themselves down into the shade to talk. But the talk soon began to drag, and then died. The stillness and the solemnity that brooded in the woods, and the sense of loneliness, began to tell upon the poor spirits of these boys, or shall I say pirates. They fell to thinking. A sort of undefined longing crept in on them. This took dim shape. Presently it was building homesickness. Even old Finn the Red-Handed was dreaming of his doorsteps and empty hogsheads. But they were all ashamed of their weakness, and none was brave enough to speak their minds. For some time the boys all had dull conscience of a peculiar sound in the distance, just as one sometimes is the ticking of a clock which he has no distant note of. But soon the mysterious sound became more pronounced and forced their recognition. The boys started and glanced at each other, and then each assumed a listening attitude. There was a long silence, profound and unbroken, and then a deep, sullen boom came floating down out of the distance. "What is that?" exclaimed Joe Harper under his breath. "I wonder," said Tom in a whisper. "It ain't thunder," said Huckleberry in an awed tone. "Because thunder is—" "Hark," said Tom. "Listen. Shh, don't say anything." They waited a time that seemed an age, and then the same muffled boom troubled the solemn hush. "Let's go and see." So they sprang to their feet and hurried to the shore towards town. They parted the bushes on the bank and peered out over the water. The little steam ferry boat was about a mile below the village, drifting with the current. Her broad deck seemed crowded with people. There were a great many skiffs rowing about or floating with the stream in the neighborhood of the ferry boat, but the boys could not determine what the men were doing. Presently a great jet-white smoke burst came from the ferry boat's side as it expanded and rose in a lazy cloud. That same dull throb of sound was borne to the listeners once more. "I know now," exclaimed Tom. "Somebody's drowned." "That's it," said Huck. "They done that last summer when Bill Turner got drowned. They shot a cannon out over the water, and that makes the body come up to the top." "Yep, and they take loaves of bread and put quicksilver in them and set them afloat, and wherever the body is that's drowned, they'll float right there and stop." "Yep, I've heard all about that," said Joe Harper. "I wonder, what makes the bread do that?" "Oh, it ain't the bread so much," said Tom. "I reckon it's mostly what they say over the bread before they start it out." "They don't say anything over it," said Huck. "I've seen them do it, and they don't." "Well, that's funny," said Tom. "But maybe they say it themselves. Of course they do." Anybody might know that. The other boys agreed that there was a reason with what Tom said, because an ignorant lump of bread, uninstructed by an incantation, could not be expected to act very intelligently when set upon an errand of such gravity. "By jings, I wish I was over there right now," said Joe. "I do too," said Huck. "I'd give heaps to know who it was that drowned." The boys listened and watched. Presently revealing thought then flashed from Tom's mind, and he exclaimed, "Boys, I know who's drowned! It's us!" They felt like heroes in an instant. Here was a gorgeous triumph. They were missed. They were mourned. Hearts were breaking of their account. Tears were being shed. Accusing memories of unkindness to these poor lost lads were rising up. And unveiling regrets and remorse were being indulged upon. And best of all, the departed were the talk of the whole town, and the envy of all the boys as far as a dazzling notoriety was concerned. This was fine. It's worth its while to be a pirate, after all. As twilight drew, the ferry boat went back to her accustomed business, and the skiffs all disappeared. The pirates returned back to camp, jubilant with vanity over the new grandeur and the illustrious trouble that they were being made for them. They caught fish, cooked supper, ate it, and then fell to guessing what the village was thinking and saying about these boys. And the pictures they drew of the public distress on their account were gratifying to look upon, from their point of view at least. But when the shadows of night closed them in, they gradually ceased to talk and sat gazing into the fire, with their minds evidently wandering elsewhere. The excitement was gone. Tom and Joe could not keep back thoughts of certain persons at home who were not enjoying this frolic as much as they were. Misgivings then came. They grew troubled and unhappy. A sigh or two escaped unawares. By and by, Joe timidly ventured upon a roundabout feeler as to how the others might look upon a return to civilization. Not right now, but Tom withered with a derision. Huck, being uncommitted as yet, to join with Tom, and the waverer quickly explained and was glad to get out of the scrape with his little taint of chicken-hearted homesickness clinging to his garments as he could. Mutiny was effectively laid to rest, for the moment. As the night got deepened, Huck began to nod, and presently to snore, and then Joe. Tom lay on his elbows motionless for a time, watching the two intently. At last he got up on his knees and went searching among the grass and the flickering reflections of the camp. He picked up and inspected several large semi-cylinders of thin white bark of sycamore, and finally chose one that seemed to suit him. He knelt by the fire and painfully wrote something on each of these with his red keel. One rolled up and put in his jacket pocket, and the other put in Joe's hat and removed it to a little distance from the owner. And he also put it in the hat and the schoolboy's treasures of almost inestimable value. Among them, a lump of chalk, an Indian rubber ball, 3 fish hooks, and one of that kind of marbles known as a sure enough crystal. Then he tiptoed his way cautiously among the trees till he felt that he was out of hearing, and straight away broke into a keen run in the direction of the sandbar. All right, I'm going to stop there. As you see, Tom's homesickness has got the better of him, and even being a tough pirate is not enough to stop him from going back home because he's worried about what Aunt Polly must be thinking. After all, the town thinks the boys are drowned and dead. So the other two seem to be enjoying it. I don't think they're enjoying it as much as they're letting on. Answer the questions, guys, on Google Docs. Check Google Classroom. And if you have any questions, I'll see you at the Google Meet 1 to 1:30. See y'all later.